Okay, today we're going to talk about Indigenous music and colonialism. And first, what I like to do is talk about some of the terminology or terms that we use when we refer to the Indigenous people. As you see from the chapter, there's a huge variety of terms by which Indigenous people in the United States and Canada identify. At the Winnipeg Powwow Club, for example, Indigenous would be understood to encompass three groups in Canada. The First Nations, which is similar to the United States term Native American. The Métis, which is often understood to designate people who have mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry. And then the Inuit people, which is a name given in Canada to certain groups indigenous to the Arctic. It is best to use a particular tribe or group's name if you're focusing on that specific group, such as the Lakota or the Chippewa, although there is an increasing preference for names in the indigenous languages. Often these groups were given these names by other outside groups. So instead of Chippewa, actually Anishinaabe is preferred. When discussing more than one group together, you might hear several terms such as Aboriginal, Native, First Nations, Indian, Alaska Native. Some of these terms are strongly rejected by some, but also strongly preferred by others. So really going by their self-identification is really important. In the book, we see most often Indigenous, Native American, Native, or Aboriginal as the terms, which may be acceptable, and sometimes it still is not an acceptable term, so you have to go with how they self-identify. All of these terms still designate groups that have been subject to what's known as settler colonialism. So what is settler colonialism? This, just like other forms of colonialism, it sought to dominate indigenous inhabitants and transform or eradicate indigenous ways of life. Settler colonialism also sought demographic advantages. It made indigenous populations into minorities in their own lands through mass settlement. And settler countries include the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan. So if you live or have lived in any of these countries, you have benefited materially from settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism interrupted a lot of things, right? We interrupted and inhibited transmission of indigenous musical traditions in addition to all of the other ways of life that were interrupted. And it really happened in the 19th century. We see a lot of prohibition of religious practices, especially like music and dance, which are central to that. Can't practice the indigenous religions. And in 1883, there was a Code of Indian Offenses that was instituted by the United States Office of Indian Affairs, which prohibited ceremonies, including the sun dance. Out of this came what's called the ghost dance. And we see in South Dakota at Pine Ridge in 1890, there was a mass killing at Wounded Knee, which was a correlate of the ban on ceremonial dancing. A group of Lakota people had taken up this ghost dance, which had recently emerged in western Nevada and spread among indigenous communities around North America, the United States. And just a few years earlier, the Lakota had defeated U.S. troops under Custer And some officials saw the ghost dance not only as breaking this law against ceremonies, but also as a threat. It was a religious dance expressing hope for a return to pre-contact life, to end the white man coming in and taking over everything. So the army was sent in to stop the dances, and this confrontation killed scores to hundreds of Lakota people. The prohibition on indigenous musical traditions and religion ceremonies lasted all the way to 1934. And then in 1934, a new policy actually prohibited interference. In Canada, there was something called the Indian Act, which was amended in 1884. It prohibited something called potluck, which was a ceremony in specifically the Pacific Northwest. This was amended again in 1927, and to add onto it, prohibiting sun dances and then these giveaways, this potlatch, it was only struck down in 1951. So the lasting effects of these prohibitions into the 20th century, they've made a big impact on the musical and religious culture of these peoples. Some indigenous communities were able to maintain traditional ceremonial life, but colonialism was deeply disruptive. Not only did you have the colonial groups moving these people off of their traditional lands onto reservations, but you also have them taking away their children and prohibiting the ways of life and learning about how to perform these ceremonies. So just a second. We have residential schools. Generations of indigenous children were actually taken out of home, to go to boarding schools, essentially, to learn in the white man's way, if you will. And this eroded their connection to family, community, their language, and ways of life. You can read more about residential schools in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada from 2015. We also see the removal of Native children from families. In the US and Canada, social workers remove Native children from families at a high rate, and they are often placed in non-Indigenous homes. There are recent efforts to place children in contexts where they can keep contact with Indigenous families and culture, but not always. And the Winnipeg Powwow Club, our opening vignette, was designed to expose Indigenous children in social care to Indigenous cultural practices. So it has that educational element in the community. It's really important. Now, Indigenous musicians and community have often made settler music and dance their own, since we now live in this world where trying to hold on to past traditions was ripped away, and we have settler music and culture that predominates. Now, Indigenous musicians have made it their own. This is sometimes in the context of immense pressure to abandon older forms. Sometimes it's just because new practices happen to appeal. And in certain instances, Indigenous musicians change settler music. Step dancing and square dancing with fiddle accompaniment was very popular among First Nations and Métis people in Manitoba since the 18th and 19th centuries, for example. And this music originated with encounters with fur traders. These styles are taught to children alongside other traditions and prompts careful consideration of the meaning of Indigenous music. In some cases, Indigenous musicians maintain older styles and others must be understood to include histories of contact and colonialism, such as the ghost dance, which was a response to the changes that came with European settlements. Let's look at a more contemporary musical example of Indigenous musicians making settler music their own and transforming it. Jeremy Dutcher is a member of the Wollastock First Nation. This is a traditional territory that includes parts of what is now New Brunswick, Canada, Maine, and Quebec, Canada. Dutcher comes from a Wollastockie speaking family, and he actually studied opera at his university, so musically trained. He studied Wollastockiic songs that were recorded from 1907 to 1913 and created new music inspired by them. And some of these songs incorporate excerpts from these recordings. The musical example that we'll end this portion of the lecture with, 12.2, you can find in Blackboard, uses a sample of these original wax cylinder recordings. This project engages with themes that we've been discussing. It exemplifies that urgent sense of need to reconnect with Indigenous languages, ideas, and musical practices after years of colonialism. It also shows that Indigenous music making is contemporary and engaged with a diverse set of styles. You'll see that it incorporates elements of pop and Western art music, such as piano, violin, and cello, and studio technologies for sound manipulation. And lastly, this piece highlights the efforts to decolonize. It challenges colonial ideologies, redresses the wrongs of colonialism, and transforms structures of inequality. So you can find Listening Guide 12.2 in the textbook, or you can pause this and follow along. What I recommend is that you do listen to it several times to become familiar with it. And the timestamps here are moments where there are different musical events. So when the melody is introduced, and a description of the musical elements, such as the rhythm and what's the accompaniment, what instruments are playing, and when the wax cylinder recording happens. Okay, so go ahead and move on to Listening Guide 12.2 and listen to the piece by Jeremy Dutcher, The Death Chant. And I will see you at the next video.